One aspect of a scaled out application is load balancing. And you've got a couple of different levels of load balancing. You have what I would call external load balancing and internal load balancing. External load balancing is when you have multiple endpoints, in other words, multiple typically web servers that people are connecting to, right? And that's the experience, that's the end user experience. And a lot of people think about that, and that's not really that difficult to implement. But you also have what I would call internal load balancing, particularly if you've got a partitioned workload, right? Where you have multiple services running and you may have multiple instances of those services, and then you need to start thinking about, okay, how is it that I'm going to handle really working with these different instances? And there's different ways that you can do that, and one way is load balancing. We'll actually also look at queuing as another possible solution to that. All right, and when we talk about load balancing, there's a couple things about it. First of all, at the very highest level, why do we want to load balance? Because we want to provide the same service from multiple instances, right? That's really what this is. I'm not going to just spin up one virtual machine that's got a web server. I'm not just going to spin up maybe even one instance of a web app, right? I want to have multiple instances. It's going to give me load balancing. It's also going to give me resiliency, right? Because if I have more than one instance and one instance goes down, as long as I have the right load balancing scheme, that becomes an availability and resilience scheme as well. Now, there's a couple things you need to think about when you're dealing with load balancers, right? First of all, what type of load balancer are you going to implement? Are you going to implement an appliance, a load balancing appliance, as you often will in an on-premise environment, or are you going to use a software load balancer? And if you use a software load balancer, is this going to be a dedicated software load balancer, or is this going to be something that's built in to either an OS that's serving other functions or built into a machine that's still running an OS but is primarily designed to be a load balancer? Right? And so that is obviously one thing that you need to consider. Another thing that you need to consider with load balancers are, what are the algorithms, right? Is it using a simple round robin? And how does it designate the way that it splits out the load between multiple servers in general? And there's different algorithms that have different levels of complexity. And finally, along those same lines, what is the stickiness of the load balancer, right? And so if I connect through a load balancer to a server, what are the rules that dictate how I stay connected to that particular server? Now, this is an application development class. This is not an infrastructure management class, but just to know, not surprisingly, since we're talking about this in Azure, there are a number of options within Azure, and there's a number of ways to implement load balancers, and the load balancers continue to become more effective and more complex. And in fact, there's even third-party open source load balance solutions that you can install on virtual machines as part of your overall Azure workload. Okay? Azure definitely has load balancing, and we'll talk about a couple different ways of doing that. One of my favorite that we'll talk about in just a minute is geographic resiliency and how we can accommodate that. All right, so load balancing is critical even if you initially, right, say, okay, I only have a single server instance. Well, if you have a single server instance and you have no load balancing, and I've got users connecting directly to that single server instance, then you have no way to scale out, right? You could scale up potentially, but you can't scale out to multiple instances, because I'm connecting directly to an instance. Then there's going to have to be some re-architecting in order to get that to scale. So as an application developer, even if you're not necessarily the person who is configuring your load balancing, it's something you always want to consider, right? And again, as I said, you want to consider that, and it's fairly common to consider that for external load balancing. My customers are coming in, they're going to be directed to one of 3 websites or web apps that are running. All right, that's fine, but what about those services that are running behind that, right? And how are you going to scale that? And obviously, for example, if you're running web apps, that's going to be pretty much inherent, as long as you're using the right tier web app, that's going to scale, right? But that back-end service, that's always something you're going to have to consider. And like I said, there's tremendous amount of load balancing built in there is load balancing built in to the Azure environment, whether it's native to Azure or even running in a virtual machine. And there's other solutions as well, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. But need to be aware of it, need to think about that from an application architecture standpoint.